Imagine a world where no one ever goes hungry. Food is unlimited, water never runs out, the temperature is always perfect, there are no predators, no diseases, no wars. On paper, it sounds like paradise. So here's the question. If every basic need was guaranteed, would society become perfect? In 1968, one scientist decided to find out. He built what many called a utopia for mice. Everything they could ever need was provided. But just a few years later, every single mouse was dead. Not because they ran out of food, not because of disease, not because another species attacked them. They simply collapsed from within. This wasn't science fiction. It was a real experiment called Universe 25. And decades later, people are still arguing about what it really proved. Because if they died in paradise, what exactly went wrong? The man behind this experiment was John Calhoun, an American behavioral scientist. For years, he had been studying one question: what happens when a population keeps growing but resources never run out? Most people believed the answer was simple. If food, water, and shelter were unlimited, life should only get better. Calhoun wanted scientific evidence, so he built a controlled environment where mice would never have to worry about survival. Every variable was carefully managed. The only thing left to observe was their behavior. He named the project Universe 25. What he expected was a thriving colony. What he witnessed instead would become one of the most discussed experiments in behavioral science. But before we look at the collapse, we need to understand how Universe 25 was actually built. Universe 25 wasn't just a cage. It was a carefully engineered environment designed to eliminate almost every challenge a mouse could face. The enclosure measured roughly 9 feet by 9 feet and was built with multiple levels, nesting areas, feeding stations, and water dispensers. The temperature was kept comfortable and there were no predators. The experiment began with 8 healthy mice, 4 males and 4 females. From that moment on, Calhoun and his team closely recorded every birth, every social interaction, and every behavioral change. At first, the results looked exactly as expected. The mice explored their new environment, built nests, formed social groups, and soon, the first generation was born. Everything suggested that the colony was on its way to becoming a perfect society. But as the population continued to grow, Calhoun noticed the first signs that something wasn't quite right. During the first phase, Universe 25 appeared to be an extraordinary success. The mice reproduced rapidly, and the population doubled roughly every 55 days. From the outside, everything looked healthy. There was plenty of food, enough nesting space, and no obvious threat to survival. But John Calhoun wasn't measuring success by population alone. He was watching how the mice interacted with one another. As the colony became larger, subtle behavioral changes began to emerge. Some dominant males started controlling the most desirable nesting areas. Other mice struggled to find a stable place within the colony. It wasn't a shortage of resources. It was the beginning of social competition. At first, these changes seemed minor, but they marked the beginning of a chain reaction that would eventually transform the entire colony. By around day 560, the colony no longer looked the way it had in the beginning. New generations of mice were being born into a world where every resource was already available. They didn't need to search for food, they didn't need to build new territory to survive. But instead of becoming more peaceful, their behavior became increasingly unusual. Some young mice wandered through the enclosure without establishing a territory of their own. Others were repeatedly chased away by dominant males. Several mothers stopped caring for their pups, and many newborns never reached adulthood. By around day 600, Calhoun noticed that a new generation of mice was growing up very differently. Many young mice never learned the behaviors that earlier generations had. Some never claimed a nesting area, some avoided social interaction whenever possible. Instead of exploring the enclosure or competing for mates, they spent most of their time eating, sleeping, and grooming themselves. Calhoun noticed that these mice looked healthy. Their fur was clean, their bodies had no scars from fighting, but they rarely participated in normal colony life. They didn't defend territory, they didn't raise families, they simply existed. Many of them spent their days following the same routine. They would wake up, eat, drink, groom themselves for long periods, then return to their nests to sleep. If another mouse approached, they often showed little interest in interacting. They rarely competed for territory. They rarely courted potential mates. And unlike earlier generations, they almost never took on the normal social roles that kept the colony functioning. To Calhoun, they appeared physically healthy, but behaviorally, they had withdrawn from society. Calhoun gave this group a name that would later become famous: the Beautiful Ones. But their appearance hid a much bigger problem, because a colony that stops reproducing has already begun its countdown to extinction, day 920. Something happened that changed the future of Universe 25 forever. The last surviving litter was born. After that, no new generation successfully replaced the old one. Many females no longer reproduced. Others gave birth, but fewer pups survived to adulthood as the older mice died. There weren't enough young mice capable of taking their place. The colony was slowly running out of future generations. At first, nothing looked dramatic. There was still plenty of food. The nesting areas were still empty. The water never stopped flowing. But the silence inside the colony was growing. Fewer newborns, fewer families, fewer normal social interactions. The population wasn't collapsing because of starvation. It was collapsing because it could no longer renew itself. From this point onward, the end of Universe 25 was no longer a possibility. It was only a matter of time. By the day 1500, Universe 25 had reached its final stage. The once crowded colony had become almost silent. There were no young mice left to replace the aging population one by one. The remaining mice died of old age. No famine had swept through the enclosure. No deadly disease had wiped them out. And food was still available until the very end. The habitat that was built to support a thriving population had become completely empty. For John Calhoun, this wasn't just the end of an experiment. It was evidence that a population can continue to exist physically while its social structure has already collapsed. He later described this idea as the first death, the collapse of normal social behaviors, and the second death, the eventual extinction of the colony that followed. But did this experiment really prove that the same thing could happen to humans? That's where the story becomes far more complicated. After the experiment ended, many people reached a simple conclusion: too much comfort destroyed the colony. But that's not what John Calhoun actually claimed. Universe 25 was never designed to predict the future of humanity. It was a behavioral experiment conducted on mice under very specific laboratory conditions. Calhoun believed that once normal social roles began to disappear, the colony entered a downward spiral that became impossible to reverse. However, many scientists argue that the experiment should not be directly compared to human society. Humans don't live like laboratory mice. We create families, communities, laws, cultures, and we constantly adapt to changing environments. That's why most researchers see Universe 25 not as a prophecy, but as a warning about the importance of healthy social structures. The experiment raised an important question: can a society remain healthy if individuals gradually lose their sense of purpose, responsibility, and connection with one another? More than 50 years later, scientists are still discussing that question. And perhaps that's the real legacy of Universe 25, because the experiment ended, but the debate never did.